I looked at that headline about Canada breaking the NAFTA system, and I had the same reaction many of you probably did. It sounds like a challenge, almost like a dare aimed at a former American president, a moment of theatrical defiance on the North American stage. You see a phrase like that, and you expect fireworks, angry press conferences, maybe a diplomatic shouting match. But if you look past the drama of the headline, there is a quieter and much more important story taking shape. It is the story of a country that has stopped treating its economic future as a side effect of someone else's politics and started treating it as something it can deliberately design. On the surface, the official story looks simple. Canada made a move that calls into question the old NAFTA logic, the assumption that the continent is organized around one big gravitational center, the United States, and that everyone else orbits around it. The way it has been framed is that Canada has taken a firm stand, that it has pushed back against the legacy of Trump era trade policy and the unpredictability that came with it. That framing is not exactly wrong, but it is shallow. It makes this moment sound like a sudden outburst instead of what it really is, the visible tip of a transformation that has been building for years underneath the headlines. For a long time, the basic deal was clear. Canada would lean heavily on access to the American market, and in exchange would accept a level of vulnerability to American political mood swings. When things were calm in Washington, that bargain seemed to work. Factories ran, trucks crossed the border, consumers on both sides enjoyed cheaper goods. When things turned turbulent, Canadian workers and firms got a crash course in what dependence really means. Tariffs that arrived with little warning, threats to tear up agreements, the sense that your next quarter depends on the outcome of someone else's election. That is not just an economic problem, it is a psychological one. What is changing now is the understanding of that relationship. The Canadian state is no longer treating integration with the United States as destiny. It is treating it as one option among several. That is what sits behind the talk about breaking the NAFTA system. It is not about ripping up a single piece of paper. It is about slowly redesigning the machinery so that North American integration is a choice, not a dependency. When a government starts to plan as if its biggest trading partner is a variable rather than a fixed point, you're looking at a deep shift in how it understands sovereignty. None of this happens overnight. Nations do not wake up one morning and decide to rethink their economic foundations because of a single personality in the White House. They move when the cumulative cost of staying inside the old model becomes greater than the cost of building a new one. Over the last several years, we have seen supply chains crack under stress, basic goods suddenly hard to find, and trade policy treated as a weapon in domestic political fights. If you are a Canadian policymaker watching that pattern repeat, the question almost asks itself, should the living standards of your citizens depend so directly on political cycles you cannot control? So the response is not a temper tantrum, it is a construction project. Behind the scenes, Canada has been investing in the ability to produce more at home, to reach more markets beyond the United States, and to write rules that are not constantly at the mercy of American partisan volatility. That can mean new ports, new logistics routes, new industrial policies that nurture domestic capacity instead of assuming that you can always import whatever you need from just across the border. It is slow, technical, sometimes boring work, but this is how dependence actually ends, not with a slogan, but with a different set of pipes and gears. There is a deeper point here about what sovereignty really looks like in a global economy. We are used to thinking of sovereignty as flags and speeches and national myths. In practice, in a world of production networks and trade agreements, sovereignty is often something much more mundane. It is the ability to make and move things without having to ask for permission. It is the ability to plan 10 or 20 years ahead without wondering whether one election in another country will blow up your path. By pushing away from automatic reliance on the American system, Canada is trying to reclaim that kind of practical sovereignty. Part of what made this shift necessary is not just what the United States did in a particular administration, but what it revealed about the structure of American politics. When a large country shows that its trade commitments can swing wildly from one election to the next, its partners take note. They look beyond the personality of the moment and see a system that treats long-term economic relationships as disposable. From that point of view, the rational response is not an angry speech. The rational response is to start building alternatives so that you are never forced to accept that level of risk again. If you felt watching this story that there was something bigger going on than a standard trade dispute, you were right. This is a story about a middle power deciding that proximity is not the same thing as security. It is about a government that has watched the same pattern of vulnerability repeat and decided that the pattern itself is the problem. And as we go deeper into this, keep one question in mind. What does it mean for a country that has long been defined in relation to a larger neighbor to finally treat that neighbor as a partner instead of an anchor? If you start from that question, what it means for a country to treat its largest neighbor as a partner rather than an anchor, you begin to see why this story is less about one announcement and more about an evolving mindset. For years, commentary around North American trade has revolved around personalities. Trump ripped up this, Biden restored that. Some future administration might reverse course again. It is tempting to think Canada's shift is a reaction to one man's style or one administration's temperament. But institutions do not rewire themselves around a single individual. They respond to patterns. From Ottawa's vantage point, the pattern has been clear. American trade policy has become more erratic, more easily captured by short-term politics, and more willing to use economic ties as leverage in unrelated disputes. That volatility may surge under one president and soften under another, but the possibility of wild swings has become part of the system itself. Once you recognize that, the question for Canada stops being how do we deal with Trump and becomes how do we deal with a United States that can flip its trade posture every 4 years. Seen in that light, Canada's move is not an emotional breakup. It is a careful redesign of exposure. The goal is not to cut ties with the United States, but to make sure those ties are no longer existential. Friendship is good. Vulnerability is not. That distinction is crucial. Dependence means every tremor in Washington is felt as an earthquake in Windsor or Vancouver. Partnership means you can absorb those tremors without your entire planning horizon collapsing. The Canadian project now underway is about moving from the first condition to the second. To get there, you need more than speeches. You need plumbing. Behind the scenes, policy staff, economists, and industry planners have been doing the unglamorous work of building buffers, mapping which supply chains are most exposed to U.S. politics, identifying sectors that can be repatriated or diversified, negotiating access to other markets, and strengthening domestic production where it makes sense. These are not headline-grabbing actions. They look like new logistics hubs, revised procurement rules, regulatory tweaks that favor local investment, and incentives that push firms to look beyond a single export destination. Over time, that kind of work changes the entire posture of a country. It means that when a U.S. administration threatens tariffs or decides to weaponize a trade dispute for domestic applause, the hit is felt, but it is no longer fatal. Canada can respond from a position of resilience rather than desperation. That is a different kind of sovereignty. Quieter, less theatrical, and far more durable. You might look at this and see pessimism, a loss of faith in the reliability of America. But there's another way to read it. This is what institutional maturity looks like. Mature democracies do not bet their long-term stability on the emotional weather of another country, however friendly. They design systems that assume volatility and still function. And that brings us to a broader truth about 21st century governance. Every country is now expected to build its own shock absorbers. The old assumption that the system will somehow protect you, that global markets will self-correct, that long-standing trade agreements are effectively permanent, has been tested and found lacking. Pandemics, geopolitical tensions, climate events, financial cycles, all of them have shown how fragile complex networks can be when they're built on habit instead of resilience. Canada's response is to engineer resilience instead of merely hoping for it. That engineering takes several forms. It means treating access to the U.S. market as one input into national planning, not the entire premise. It means cultivating other trading relationships even when the American market is still attractive, precisely so that alternatives exist if the political winds shift. It means enhancing domestic capacity in sectors where over-reliance on imports creates strategic or social risk, from critical materials to essential manufactured goods. Importantly, this is not framed as punishment for the United States. The Canadian stance is not, we are turning away from you. It is, we are making sure that our welfare does not depend on your predictability. In practical terms, that reclassifies the United States from the assumed center of gravity to a powerful but non exclusive partner. That reclassification can feel unsettling, especially for those who grew up with the idea that North America is naturally organized around one dominant pole. But look at it from the perspective of the citizens whose livelihoods are on the line. Workers in industries tied tightly to cross border trade have watched jobs whipsaw with every new tariff threat, every renegotiated agreement, every uncertainty about what comes next. For them, this shift isn't an abstract geopolitical gamble. It's a bid for a future in which their mortgage, their factory, their town is not always one angry tweet away from crisis. This is the human layer that often gets flattened out when we talk about treaties and acronyms. Trade agreements are not just about macroeconomic efficiencies. They are frameworks that decide whose job is stable and whose job is precarious. When a country like Canada says, in effect, we are going to broaden our base and reduce single market dependence, it is saying to its citizens, we will not leave your security entirely at the mercy of another capital's political cycle. There is also a subtle message to democracies more broadly. Canada's recalibration shows that democratic institutions can still engage in long-term thinking, even in an era dominated by short-term outrage and hyper-fast news cycles. It shows that you can look at the structural vulnerabilities revealed over a decade: volatile partners, fragile supply chains, politicized trade, and choose to adapt before the next catastrophic shock, not after. That, more than any diplomatic soundbite, is why this moment matters. It suggests that democratic systems are still capable of strategic patience, of building new architectures rather than merely reacting to the latest disruption. For the United States, there is a lesson here as well, even if it is not one Washington is eager to hear. Being the default destination for your neighbor's exports, talent, and capital is a powerful position, but it is not guaranteed. If your partners begin to see engagement with you as a risk factor rather than a stabilizing anchor, they will, over time, reorient. Not out of anger, but out of prudence. Influence based on instability is inherently self-limiting. It pushes others to seek escape routes. For everyone else watching, from Europe to Asia to the global South, the Canadian case is a kind of demonstration. It shows how a medium-sized democracy can start weaning itself off inherited assumptions about security and prosperity and build a new model centered on internal capacity and diversified ties. It is not an argument for isolation. It is an argument for cooperation grounded in choice rather than necessity. And this brings us back to you, the citizen sitting on the other side of the screen, perhaps far from the actual border in question. Why should any of this matter to you? Because the same forces shaping Canada's decisions are shaping the context of your own civic life. The way countries manage uncertainty determines how stable your job is, how predictable your cost of living is, whether your government feels free to plan beyond the next election. When you understand why a country like Canada is reorganizing its economic foundations, you gain a clearer sense of how fragile or resilient your own institutions might be in a world where volatility is the norm, not the exception. In that sense, Canada's break with the old NAFTA logic is not just a regional trade story. It is a case study in democratic self-respect. A reminder that genuine partnership begins when dependence ends, and that real sovereignty today is less about lines on a map than about the capacity to build stability from within. At this point, the question I posed earlier starts to come into sharper focus. What does it actually mean for a nation to grow into its own economic identity? For much of its modern history, Canada has been described with a shorthand that sounds tidy but is quietly limiting. A middle power whose fortunes rise and fall alongside decisions made in Washington. That story was never entirely wrong, but it was always incomplete. It treated geography as destiny and U.S. politics as the horizon of what was possible. What we're watching now is Canada methodically rewriting that script. Not with a dramatic break, not with some cinematic declaration of economic independence, but with something more patient and more mature: the construction of a system that allows Canada to stand upright in a world that does not reward dependence. The headline talks about breaking NAFTA. The reality is about outgrowing a posture. That posture, for decades, mixed cooperation with caution and compromise. It allowed Canada to extract real benefits from close integration with the United States. But it also baked in blind spots, assumptions about American stability, about the permanence of rules, about the benign nature of dependence that have not aged well in an era defined by volatility. Once you see that the stabilizing force you relied on is no longer reliably stabilizing, you face a blunt choice: nostalgia or adaptation. Canada has chosen adaptation, and that choice tells us something important about sovereignty in the 21st century. Sovereignty is no longer primarily about raising barriers or shouting louder. It is about capacity, the capacity to make long-term plans and stick to them, the capacity to invest without waiting for someone else's election returns, the capacity to participate in global markets on equal footing rather than as a permanently junior partner. This is why it's a mistake to read Canada's move as an anti-American gesture. It isn't a rebellion, it's a recalibration. The United States is still a friend, still a crucial trading partner, still a cultural and economic giant, but it is no longer the axis around which every Canadian decision must rotate. In practical terms, America moves from center of gravity to one powerful node in a wider network. That shift carries a quiet challenge for the United States as well, whether Washington wants to hear it or not. For a long time, American influence in North America rested on the assumption that neighbors had no serious alternatives. Their exports, their talent, their investment would flow south almost by default. But defaults are not birthrights. They last only as long as they feel safer than the alternatives. When unpredictability becomes a governing style, partners don't storm out of the room. They start quietly looking for other rooms. Canada's planners have been doing exactly that, not slamming the door on the United States, but making sure there are other doors to walk through, other markets to cultivate, other supply chains to rely on, other frameworks in which to exercise agency. If there is a lesson here for American leadership, it is painfully simple. Stability is not a luxury you extend to allies when convenient. It is the foundation of your influence. Leadership anchored in reliability invites partnership. Leadership anchored in volatility invites recalculation. But let's bring this back down from capitals and chanceries to where you actually live your civic life. Why should any of this matter to you? Whether you live in Canada, the United States, or somewhere entirely different? Because the stability of the systems we're talking about determines whether your job is secure, whether your mortgage feels safe, whether your government can plan beyond the next election. When a country strengthens its economic footing, it strengthens the range of choices available to its citizens. When it allows its foundations to be dictated by someone else's political mood, those choices shrink. The communities most entangled in cross-border trade, auto workers, farmers, exporters, port cities, have experienced this firsthand. For them, talk of revisiting NAFTA was never just about tariff schedules. It was about real anxiety. Will the plant stay open? Will this contract be honored? Will the next administration put my town on the bargaining table? Canada's shift is, at bottom, a response to those anxieties, not a promise to insulate every worker from global forces. That would be fantasy. But a recognition that institutions have a responsibility to reduce avoidable vulnerability, to make sure that when shocks come, they come from the world itself, not from a partner using dependence as leverage. That's what I mean when I talk about democratic seriousness. Democracies do not prove their worth only at the ballot box. They prove it in the slow, often unseen work of adapting structures before crises become unmanageable. Canada's pivot is an example of that kind of seriousness. An admission that the old arrangement no longer served the public interest as well as it once did, followed by the hard work of building something sturdier. And that is why this moment has drawn so much attention. It is not just a Canada-US story, it is a test case in a larger question. Can modern democracies still think in decades rather than in news cycles? Can they still re-engineer their systems in response to structural risk, not just in reaction to the latest outrage? Which brings us back to the question I want to leave you with. If stability can no longer be assumed, if it must be built, what does genuine national independence require in a world like this? It cannot mean isolation. No country is big enough, rich enough, or insulated enough to wall itself off from global forces. It cannot mean nostalgia for some imagined past when borders solved everything. It has to mean something more demanding: the steady construction of institutions that can withstand volatility without retreating from cooperation. Canada, in its quiet way, is trying to show one version of that path. You may find its approach convincing or flawed, ambitious or overcautious, but it forces all of us to confront the same underlying reality. In an age when uncertainty is the rule, not the exception, sovereignty is no longer about declaring independence from other nations. It is about declaring independence from uncertainty itself, and then doing the difficult work required to make that declaration real. As we follow this arc to its next stage, that question we've been circling around starts to feel less abstract. What does it actually look like in practice for a nation to grow into its own economic identity? It starts with a very simple act of recognition. Geography is not destiny. For a long time, Canada's place in the world was described with a sort of shorthand: a middle power, a reliable neighbor, a country whose economic weather report could be read by looking at the sky over the United States. That description was convenient, even comforting. It made the North American order feel settled, almost natural, as if the map itself had written the rules. But the last decade has exposed how fragile that story really was. Canada has begun to rewrite the script, not by storming out of the room, but by rearranging the furniture. Instead of organizing its economic life around the assumption that Washington will always be the stabilizing force, it is building a framework where stability is generated at home. Instead of treating access to the U.S. market as a destiny, it is treating it as one component of a broader strategy. That's the heart of this break with the old NAFTA logic. Not a tantrum, a maturation. For generations, Canada's approach to its southern neighbor mixed genuine partnership with systemic caution. The result was a lot of shared prosperity, but also a set of habits of deferring, of assuming certain rules would never change, of telling itself that deep dependence was simply the price of being next door to the world's largest economy. Those habits worked until they didn't.